I'd like to describe them a bit more.
Item 9.2, selecting the electoral system for local body elections, page 35. Diane.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I haven't got anything to add to the report, but what I would like to do is take the opportunity to remind members of the context of the electoral system choice in terms of the wider democratic review process that we'll be going through. There are three separate parts to the democratic review process, the electoral system choice being the first part. So a decision on the single transferable vote first past the post, which must be made by the 12th of September, hence the paper before members today, is the first part. Next, there's the consideration of the option of a Maori ward. A decision on that must be made by the 23rd of November. So before then, I'll be returning to see members with a paper with recommendations both from Te Whakaminenga o Kapiti and Te Atiawa ki Whakarongatai for members' consideration. And then that's followed by the representation review proper. The actual representation review must be undertaken every 6 years. So for our next one, this technically runs from the 1st of March 2021 to the 31st of December 2021. So the choice of the electoral system and whether to establish a Maori ward are precursors to that representation review. The representation review itself must consider communities of interest and fair and effective representation of these communities of interest. It is a lengthy and complex process, and here we are starting with our first decision today. So I hope that's of assistance, just placing this decision in the broader context. Happy to take any questions on the actual paper through you, Mr. Mayor.
You will take paper apart from the paper itself, in terms of what you've described, the different stages. Any other questions on that one? Otherwise, any questions on the paper? Councillor Elliott.
Thank you so much. I was present for the briefing and it was really, really useful information. However, I just want some clarification about recommendation 23. So that is saying that either council chooses itself, STV or first past the post, or that the council decides to put it out to the community and get the community to respond to a poll on it. Is that right?
So council can choose and select whichever option, single transferable vote or FPP. That has to be publicly advertised once that decision is made, and at that point members of the public have the opportunity to demand a poll. Second option, council can decide not to choose and actually put it out for a poll for public comment. Yeah, that's kind of it, really. Yeah.
Okay, so we can resolve here today
yes.
an outcome to put it out for a poll ourselves.
You could do that, yes. There are costs to consider which are referenced in the report, which aren't insignificant. But yes, absolutely, that is a decision that could be made by members.
Thank you.
Councillor Coates.
Two questions. The first one I'll just tag on, leading on from Councillor Elliott. So just confirming the cost to do so if there was a poll was $85,000 from the report.
Yes.
And that's unbudgeted.
It is unbudgeted, yeah.
Okay. And the second part was, depending on what the council votes for in terms of STV and FPP, if there was support for STV, are we able to do some comms around and I'm thinking of the way that we've done the little videos, but around actually using the STV system? Because despite sitting at this table over the years and having people coming in and saying that it's actually ignorant of us to assume that people don't know how it works, and that shouldn't be a reason to vote against it. The reality is, when you talk to people, they don't know how it works. So I'm just mindful of that in terms of what I support. Any decision needs to be supported by helping people make those decisions.
Yes, we could certainly look into helpful comms for the community in terms of STV if that was the road that we went down.
Chief Executive.
Rolling ahead to a subsequent report on our agenda today, one of the suggestions in there responding to the org review is that we kind of beef up the civics education program. So they're kind of linked decisions really. We always do a civics education program, but what I'm hearing very clearly would be endorsed by staff, that the opportunity to explain the how it works is something that we look at. It will be proposed because it will require probably a bit more resourcing than what we've allowed, I suspect.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you. I just wonder, there's probably a couple of parts to this question. If we change to a first past the post system, does that create an impetus requiring that the next council elections also change?
They are two separate decisions, so it would really be for members to decide at the time if there were any impact on an earlier decision, from an earlier decision on that decision for the next election.
Does council consider that if we were to change now and then have to make another decision in 2 years' time, that might create confusion using, moving backwards and forwards from one system to another?
It may indeed. So just to be clear, in terms of council's decision, if council decides to stay with the existing system today, then that is set for the next election. If council chooses to change, it's set for the next two. That's the way it works. So that's clear in the wording of the recommendations 21, 22, 23. I hope it's a little bit clearer now. I've highlighted that.
And the final question, thank you, is that has there been any public groundswell or feedback to council asking for a change from what I see as a very good system? Just to nail my colours to something that's democratic.
No, there hasn't been any groundswell either way.
Thank you.
Councillor Elliott again.
Not so much a question, but I just wanted to add to James's discussion. But I can do this in debate if possible. But when we had, was it the gentleman from the Electoral Commission speak, he did clarify for the first time I've ever heard that it's not actually their responsibility to carry out nationwide education on how to use STV system. And for the first time ever, I mean, I've had years and years of lobbying them to have an education program across the country, and they've always said there's no budget. We haven't decided to do that yet. We would do it if more councils came on board and used STV, because at the current there's quite certainly a majority use first past the post. But this year when he was asked, he said, actually, it's not our responsibility. It's up to each individual council to commit to running the education programs that are necessary for your own communities. So I don't think that we have a decision, should we go with STV again, I don't think we have a choice about whether or not we run a community-wide education program about this. I think we really should, we must do it.
Just to clarify, Dale Ossowski, rather than being from the Electoral Commission, is from a company called Electoral Services. Yes, that's right.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. I was just going to indicate that I'm happy to move recommendation 21.
If there are no other questions, go and you want to talk on it?
Thank you. I was just going to echo the comments made by Councillor McCann during the questions there that STV is, I think it is a good voting system. I think it there is an argument that it is slightly more complicated and that people have to 10 or something in order to be able to vote, or just wherever they want to rank to. But actually, I think it delivers, it gives people ability to actually pick a candidate that's more reflective of their views on an issue. And if their first choice doesn't get in, they have someone who still better reflects it than just the sort of binary choice that first past the post gives us. So I'd like to encourage people to support going with the status quo on this.
Councillor Holborough.
Yes, I'd like to speak in support of the recommendation. I think it particularly suits our representation, where district-wide we're selecting 5 people and we're selecting a number of people for our community boards. I think being able to prioritise those people is much better than just ticking 5. I think first past the post would make more sense if we actually changed that during the representation review, but as we haven't been through that process yet, I'm inclined to stick with the STV system.
Councillor McCann.
I would just like to agree with myself through Councillor Compton and the Deputy Mayor. I think STV provides an opportunity for people to be able to look at a range of options, and I think it's just far more representative, which is something that as councillors and as a council we're always striving to be.
Councillor Martin Holliday.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just really responding to Mr. Maxwell's comments around the public education side of things. So I think it's an important aspect of this moving forward, and just reflecting on the financial training that we had recently, something similar to that in the lead-in to the next elections I think would be very, very helpful, and then having that resource sitting on the website in a similar sort of fashion as the financial ones would be very, very helpful in that space.
Councillor Coates.
Yeah, look, in principle, I don't have an issue with the STV voting system and the rationale behind how it works and so forth. My comments have just come from, I mean, you'll find in this role as an elected member, you do get asked by people, 1, who to vote for, and then 2, how the heck does it work? And so it's really just through that experience of people right across the district, not just in Otaki, and the lack of understanding around it, how STV works. And so I'm happy to support it. I just would like to see, not just us but all councils, just put some resource behind making people more aware of when they put those numbers on the sheets what they mean. And I have no doubt there's a lot of invalid votes too from people not understanding how the system works as well. Personally don't think full-on workshops are going to work, probably more some helpful short videos that can be shared and easily sort of deciphered in a minute or 2. But certainly we need to educate people around how to use the STV system.
Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, I'd just like to total all of that and to just state the importance of making sure that engagement reaches all corners of our community, our youth, our seniors, people who maybe don't have access to internet so might not be able to watch videos. So just the importance of making sure that if we're striving for an accessible system, that the ways in which we're educating people about that system is also accessible.
So the recommendation 21 moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by myself. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against, carried. Thank you very much. Thank you. And on item 9.2, responding to the independent organisational review. Page 43.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will take the privilege of stating those infamous words, can we take the report as read? Happy to take any questions.
Right, now Councillor.
Thank you.
I didn't mention the name yet. Katie Spires.
Thank you.
Chair of the Paraparaumu Ramadi Community Board. First question of the block.
Thank you. Page 47, recommendation 30, it says staff reporting back quarterly. Now, I understand that staff are, after the other things been happening, but I understand staff are really, really busy. And I'm just wondering, is this too onerous on council to reporting back, on staff to reporting back quarterly?
Thank you very much, Kathy. And yes, I think the councillor was just explaining to you that he has raised a similar concern, and so we're very grateful for those concerns, quite genuinely. The intention in that is that it will simply be one more item within the quarterly reporting that we already do. So the quarterly report to strategy and operations on the work program and delivery against our annual plan. So we will add a separate piece of program work which simply reports back against those milestones. So it will only be as comprehensive as the work progresses. That was the proposal, so not something separate.
Thank you so much for this report. It was a really interesting reading and really positive that it's already been implemented this morning, well before it's even made it to the table. I just had a query about under point 12, page 44 on focus areas 12.1.2, where it says that elected members need to be able to rely on council leadership for strategy and policy advice to inform governance decision making. Kind of we understood through our training and our external training that it was up to elected members and council to set strategy and then council staff to work on policy based on the strategy. So I was just wanting to bring that up and for comment.
Thank you, councillor. So what it means is our role is advisory. So when you want to set a strategy, we will bring the work to you and we'll inform you about the strategy that you've asked for or that's on the work program, and we'll give you those options, and then you'll make the governance decision about where you want to go with that strategy, and then we implement it. So the process for strategies, for policies and for our operations is we'll bring you some advice, that's our role, you'll make the decision and then we'll implement it.
His Worship, the Mayor has got a question. I'm looking at paragraph 12.3.1, where let me preface that with the question that I asked Tom Gott in terms of when he landed the report with us. I asked, of all this that you got recommendations, which is a key one that holds everything together? And he pointed out that the operating model is the one that he put the first effort into. Can you explain to me here why we have this sentence, and I quote, "While an operating model may contribute to increased clarity in this area, we believe there are a number of other actions that will also contribute to making this clearer." Where does his comment stand within your perception of what we need to do?
The message that you take from what he said is it's not always clear how the strategies translate to the operations of the organisation. And we, like many other councils, would say between our statutory frameworks and our own operating models that are in place, that's always there. So therefore what I clearly take as the inference is it hasn't been communicated as effectively as it might. So I think part one is to look at what's right or wrong about the way we currently do things and the structures that we have in place, and then decide whether it's worth that piece of work being completed. And as you'll see, we've proposed that we scope that out as part of it. So to give you some examples of what things are already in place, we have a fairly standard approach of strategy and vision and strategy, culture and values, and then operations. And within each of those, there's a program of work. We don't, because a lot of that is operational in terms of how we implement it, we work a lot on that with staff, but not so much with the elected members. So if part of the gap is understanding those pieces of work already in play, we'd be very happy to look at how we can work through that. It's partly recognising that it wouldn't necessarily be an inconsequential piece of work to come up with a new operating model and want to implement it. So it's always one of those things, especially in the COVID environment, being careful what you leap into and understanding what it means. So we would just like to work through scoping what that piece of work would look like, and bring it to you and have a conversation before we leapt into saying yes or no.
Okay. No, that's good. Councillor McCann?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I was actually going to focus on exactly the same issue of the operating model. We had a presentation in one of the solutions. Possible ways forward was to have a workshop with senior leadership team and councillors regarding an operational model. I was wondering whether that part of that verbal recommendation was considered as an alternative to council going away and coming up with some recommendations.
It will be part of, we'll come back to you and say, based on the work we've done so far, this is what we're thinking. How do you feel about that? A couple of comments. You'll see that it's labelled an operating model, not a governance model. So actually, well, quite clearly what it says is the onus is back on understanding the operation and how it translates strategy. So the first piece of work is for staff to have a look at that. And we've had a look at some versions of operating models that wonderful consultancy firms all around the world punt out, and we can see how they work, but we can also see how the local government legislative framework sets in place a lot of the things that we're required to do and the way we're required to do them anyway. So we want to see how those two things fit together before we leap into it. In terms of how we might progress it, that hasn't been done. That's a piece of work, as I say, where we will look to scope it and say to you, this is what we're thinking.
You're still thinking deeply, sir.
I'm thinking, and now I might end thinking, so it might be a grinding noise that you hear. I think quite clearly how you frame whether it's an operating model or a way of working model could come up with a different answer. I wonder, and there might be collective memory around the room, I'm not sure that the Mark and Jenkins organisation was referring to operational. It was how we operate between councillors and council in a model that could be conceived, just to clarify.
So having sat through those briefings, what he said was it's not clear always how strategy is being translated into operations, and the gap is in the communication of that. And he said, as a consultant, one of our pieces of advice would be to agree an operating model as a way of being clear about how it will be delivered. So the sorts of operating models that we've researched in terms of helping, because his answers about what does that look like weren't particularly conclusive for you, if you recall. So some of the work that we looked at showed that a lot of it is how you structure the organisation to deliver, how you deliver your operations. So think about things like in-source, outsource. And they aren't directly, all of those elements of an operating model aren't directly related to how we want to govern and what outcomes we want. That sits over the top of it in most of those models. So it's all there for us to bring to you and say, here are some examples. We're just saying that obviously, like many of these pieces of work, we haven't done it yet. We just want to have some time as part of the work program to work through it and bring it to you. Definitely took on board that Mr. Gott felt that was, as the Mayor said, if there was one thing you'd recommend, what would it be? He said that. Not at all tongue-in-cheek, I would say that's what you should expect from a consultant, is the next piece of work that I could help you with would be something like this. And we're really open to that as long as we feel that it adds value.
So this is not end of the journey, it is just the beginning. That's how I take it. Councillor Coates.
Yeah, I've got a number of questions, but actually building on that first one, which was my first question. We'll obviously all interpret the recommendations a little bit differently in our own way, often getting to the same outcome. What I took from it was there's that operational model around, the word for me that I liked was implementation, and Wayne, you talked about from the strategy, so we think ED strategy to actually implementing and the process it from there to get to there and how that is done. That's for me implementation. Agree in a strategy and then you look at the implementation of it. I did pick up in the report though the other aspect, and I think they're not one and the same, they're two separate ones, and that is the relationship between operational and governance and how that model works. I think that's a separate discussion. Where my question is in that preamble was around looking at the outcomes in the document, Wayne, where the implementation aspect of that sits, having some reassurance that the implementation of we decide ABC and then implementation looks like this and it's clearly articulated, that sits in that review. The last sort of bit on that 12.3.1 says scoping for an operating model alongside other actions. You see that sitting in there? Okay, I just wanted a reassurance that it's been considered. The next one I had was around the 12 12.4.1, which is around the focused area based on the principles of aiming to always exceed the minimum requirements for consultation, many don't want to be involved in the community in consultation. We hear that. They just want to get on with life, do the work. They, in many aspects, do trust that the council's doing their job. But what they do want to know, if they want to look, is the why or the rationale. Not to just trust us, we've got this, but actually if they do want to know, hey, tell us about that project, that the rationale is here. So it's referred to in the table below, but again, how do you see that being addressed through the actions that are there? The concern is that it's that the focus is there just to sort of exceed the thing around consultation, but if you're just doing well at consulting but people aren't engaging the consultation for whatever reason, we may not be doing well in providing the rationale.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm pretty sure I understand, and the last word you used was the word in my mind. The rationale was what was discussed often, that making sure that we have a clear rationale for why we are or are not doing something is the piece that was identified as most often not having got through very well. So whilst it's a broad theme to say we want to do, we're not aiming for minimum, we're aiming for a good standard. There needs to be lots of instances. I guess civics education was one we just talked about, where we need to put a lot more effort into figuring out exactly how we want to promote, for example, the voting system. So I guess what I'm saying is not everything is spelled out in this report, as we've mentioned, that everything we do, we want to make sure we're thinking about that theme of the rationale and the why.
Could I clarify my point just so that it's succinct? If we think of Aotearoa Park as an example, if you were involved in the consultation and we did the consultation well, you'd know you could argue you know the rationale. My point is more, if you weren't involved, how would you find out that rationale? If suddenly, as a newcomer, you want to know the rationale behind that, and will we be doing that? So the next one I have was on page 46, number 20, around tangata whenua. And when I ask this question, I'm not saying that it's not, I guess I just want a reassurance. They were heavily involved in the review, they were interviewed and so forth. How will we involve iwi moving forward on the org review? It's referred to, I think, in my notes here on it's partly referred to on number 21, the next line there. Because I understand, like, as a team, your team have had a look at it. Our team have had a look at it in terms of elected members, and we've had a discussion between the two teams, but I'm not too sure from a partnership perspective how, whether they've had a hui separately about it, whether there's been one between them and us. My worry is that we're like, right, marching on, getting the work done and developing all this, but without taking them with us as partners in the discussion. And then I've got a couple more.
So I could stand to be corrected, but no, we haven't. We certainly haven't been involved in a hui with them to look at this. In terms of the timing, bearing in mind the recent resurgence, it's slightly reduced everything that we want to do. But also in terms of process, I still would prefer that we've landed our thoughts with you. If we've got a steer that you're comfortable with it as a starting point, that's when we start the program of work. So it is a little bit mixed. I'll ask Janice to talk to you a little bit about what has happened, but it is from my perspective very much the beginning of that journey.
Can I just add one observation on that?
Yeah.
No, just on that. My recollection is in my communication that at least one of the EB was going to come back and talk about what their response is to the report. So I haven't seen that.
Yeah, do you mind if I clarify a little bit further? My concern is, through good intention, we assume, based on the report, what the solutions are to satisfy the iwi concerns, whether they're right or wrong. The danger is if those assumptions aren't accurate in terms of the solution. So, yeah, I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but if I guess we have a discussion with them around the solutions, then yeah, I think we're heading sort of more in the right direction.
I think the appendix down there of this report, can I have some assurance that that'll go to Te Whakameninga and the other EV?
That's why I'm standing here, actually. I'm waiting to leap in and say that to the next Te Whakamininga meeting, we will be taking a report that formally tables the organisational review report with Te Whakamininga and makes some recommendations and seeks their advice about how we start what I imagine will be a long, rich conversation with our iwi partners about the recommendations that are in that report. And the actions that you see at this stage largely relate to our perspective on ourselves, and we have tried very hard not to reflect at this stage on iwi and what they might need to see from this. The report acknowledges that starting that conversation is the important next step.
The next one was on I sort of looked at it as around strategic considerations around the actions. Wayne, how, and it was something that I actually hadn't thought about myself, but in terms of the actions or solutions to the recommendations, and I don't think there's probably an answer for it today, but how would we look at measuring success?
Yes, again, in the perfect world, we would have provided you a lot more detail, including suggesting some ways of measuring that. But we acknowledge that we haven't had the space to be able to do that, so that has to follow. We have, there are some ideas and some are quite self-evident, but I would rather that part of this, as we develop it, we map out success would look like, and here's the KPI that you might be able to look to see if it's delivering.
Lastly, the last one's more of a comment, but it's not really for debate. Look, Wayne, I said to you I was actually quite impressed with some of the actions in the diagram further down below, but I want to draw particular attention to the one around independent audit of resource and building consent applications, because many will know there's been criticism of this council for some time around the consent process dealing with Kapiti Coast District Council. What the review did highlight is that that's not shared by the independent reviewer. But I guess what I want to note or actually acknowledge is the council, the SLT and Wayne and that have said, well, despite that, we still, from what I can perceive by the report, still feel there's value in terms of reviewing that area. It doesn't show to me, I guess, so we'd for an arrogant approach that, well, no, we've got it all sorted. There's still a willingness to sort of review that area, and I just wanted to draw attention to that. So,
thank you. I should leave it there then, shouldn't I? But I won't. I'll damage myself by clarifying a little bit. Part of what I want to see is a review of the applications by applicant, because a lot of the problems repeat. And so if we, this comes back to discussions we've had before about if you look at the data in a different way, it might give you a different insight. So what I'm interested in doing is understanding over a period of time the quality of applications we're receiving in those two spaces, and to look for consistent themes. One of the things that a sector meeting that we had was, can you please tell us what the theme of the month is? What's the thing that everybody's slightly getting wrong? Because often it'll be that's a recent tweak to the building regulations or something that maybe hasn't filtered right out. So there's those benefits, but it is also so that we can go back to specific applicants or their agents and say, hey, you're consistently not doing this thing. Let's work together on fixing that. And then, if it says actually the issue is in the way council is processing them, being inconsistent or something like that, it will also draw that out.
And just noting it was at least one of the topics that came up over the last couple of days too in terms of consent process. So anyway, thank you.
Number of days did you do it?
So the IANZ audit, the people involved like to tell me that it was probably the best result they've ever seen, and I did sit in the meeting where they said that in the country. Now, the backhander to that is if we're really good at fulfilling our regulatory obligations, it's probably quite tough in terms of all the tick boxes that applicants have to do. But that's what we're obliged to deliver, and people need to understand that doing our job well means you've got to tick all those boxes and do all of those steps. What the Mayor's referring to is we're having a discussion yesterday about pre-COVID, our building consent average turnaround was 11 days, and our resource consents was 17. So yes, the clock stops if things are not right. There are all those issues. But speed, which people often say is the problem, I could not agree with as being a problem here at the moment. And one of the reasons is probably that we're not swamped with 6% per annum growth. That would probably be causing us different problems. So I want to get to the quality of the work as being perhaps where the toing and froing goes on, not speed. People say it relates to speed, but you've heard me say repeatedly, if the application is 100% when it comes in, it's going to go through really fast. And if we can help people to make the applications more like 100% when they come in, we'll all be happier.
Councillor Prabhanov.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Correct.
Applause. Thank you.
So thank you, Wayne, for providing us with this report. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. One is I am a bit disappointed that the operating model hasn't been, I suppose, looked at maybe in the way that was mentioned in the report. I'll leave it at that. But I just also wanted just to go on to the action point. So table appendix 1. So I see here that so this is actually a draft. But I have to say, to me, actions are actually, and you've mentioned it before, I just want to reiterate the need to provide, probably sooner than later, measurable actions. So, for example, when you've got comments like looking for mentoring opportunities, that to me is not anything that can be measured. And the other thing that I think that we also need to have are timeframes. And I see that it mentions that a lot of this will go into the long-term plan, but it also mentions that that there's no opportunities for initiatives in this current year, even though that some of these actions are being implemented. And sometimes it's not actually having to do spend money. It's actually just the way you actually do things, and they actually don't cost anything, and in the long term they may well be saving money. So I just wanted to make those points. Thank you.
I will say in response that, yeah, as we explained, due to things like the COVID resurgence, things that we might have liked to put in, more like timeframes and measures, aren't there, and that we'll just continue to work on that. A number of these things are only proposed because it is subject to funding being made available, but if it says planned or other words like that, that means that we're doing it. I've heard your other comments about things like tangible outcomes. In my perspective, if we manage to get one mentor alongside one elected member, that would be quite measurable, and that's the sort of way we will know. If we don't, the question will be, is it because nobody wanted one, or because we haven't made progress in that space? I know that's a very small example,
yeah.
But...
So just then a follow-up question. So it's going to be reported on quarterly. When is that going to start in the next quarterly report that we have coming? It will do.
Well, yes, Councillor. I mean, it's in play if you accept it. So I would expect, whilst we are only not that far away from the end of a quarter, that would mean that probably the first report will say you adopted our response report. Probably won't say a lot more other than being able to update on any work that is already in progress. So yeah, I expect every quarterly report will start to talk to it.
Thank you.
I just had sort of one further question that I'd missed. The concern with people reading the report is that we've received it. There's been some time the staff have fed back in terms of this document today, and some of the actions in there are talking about LTP, which is early next year, and they're thinking, crikey, it could be 12 months before this report is even action. But as the report refers to in terms of there's some in there that's planned. Some of these changes are already underway. If anything, some have actually already been implemented in a small way, like, for example, briefings on a Tuesday. So I think that I don't know I'm trying to think in terms of a question, how do we incorporate that into it? Because again, my worry is the perception of, oh, nothing's done for this for 12 months. And that's not an accurate perception, but I can see how people could come to that perception not understanding what actually has already been done and what currently is being changed, but maybe not necessarily reflective in this report.
If I may, we'll take away that as feedback to try and make sure that we're demonstrating that. The comments we've made all the way through this is it's not as if we've been sitting in a void not trying to improve things, even before we received the report.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise that many of the things the report came up with came from us saying, here are improvements that we've already identified. But I appreciate that what you're saying is people will go, well, that's nothing because that wasn't what we were looking for. So we do need to find a way to explain that if you like, the continuous improvement that we should always make and how we're delivering against that, we can reflect within this. I hope that you will also see some proposed things turn into underway or planned, and you'll see proposals come forward for funding various things. I also hope that you will continue to see this list change. Either things drop off or be added on. Good example being once we sit down with iwi and they come up with some stuff, well, this was what would deliver for us, there may be opportunities there, for example.
Yeah, sure. Guru, if there's no further questions on...
James Westbury.
Mr. Westbury, you there?
Doesn't see the library in the appendix.
James Library Westbury, are you there? No. Well,
Is he watching on Zoom or live streaming?
did he signal to you that he's got a question? Anyway, have we got a seconder for that? Is James moving that? Jenna Holbrook.
We're waiting another second or two for James.
Grayson, sorry. Grayson, can you change it?
Oh, look, it's just while we're waiting for Mr. Westbury, it's interesting with the presentation from Martin Jenkins on the COVID recovery, because obviously they've got their whole operating models and diagrams and charts, because you see them implementing that themselves, and it's probably a more simpler version in terms of their delivery of the COVID recovery when we think about what that sort of implementation / operating looks. And I can imagine if we work that up, it will show at what points it's appropriate for elected members to be involved, what's operational, and then back again, what's governance. And that could be shown in a operating model / chart.
Yeah, look, it was interesting. First of all, the jargon, if you like, to sort of get in behind what he was meaning, and I think one particular version that I saw set out quite a good process to go through before you conclude what does an operating model look like. What are the questions you want to ask? And he did refer exactly to some of those things. If you're seeing a gap between strategy and implementation, that's a reason why you might want to do this piece of work. So having found, if you like, a relevant model where I could see where he was coming from, my thinking was I'd be quite happy, quite interested in bringing that example back to you. Walk you through the pieces of the process so that you could go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. Those are the steps that we could see this process going through, and if you like it, we could do it. If we all like it, it certainly isn't an item that can be in this year's plan because there is no money for it. It would never be cheap. So if we like it, it will buy us the time to stick it in the long-term plan for next year as a piece of work. Or to consider it anyway.
Are we in debate, Your Worship? Yes.
I'll tell you what, we carry on the debate.
Yep. Fabulous. I just wanted to give an example of how rationale would be explained as we were taught at our GNZ conference, and that would be, at the moment there's a piece of work coming up about road safety at Ramiti Village. So I've seen a piece on it in the newspaper, and I've seen an email on it come out internally to elected members. I'm not sure if that went to the public. I'm sure it's on the KZSC website. However, if we were doing the telling the why story correctly right now, there would be a video made and it would be
Hello?
shown in schools and all sorts of things. Should I? Yeah.
James Westbury.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you ask your question?
Yeah, indeed. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps logging out. Or just with regards to the review, just with regards to community boards, it just talks about supporting them with technology. I don't think, and a generic word called support. Whilst you're already engaging with iwi, it would be helpful if the community boards were actually being engaged in parallel as elected members too, and sort of how those recommendations can be presented to board members through a formal mechanism.
I just acknowledge that. I think I take it less a question, more a request, and so we'll take that on board. Community boards had the same level of engagement as iwi did in this, and as was mentioned, we haven't yet gone back to re-engage with iwi, and nor have we with community boards, but yes, absolutely, we will do that.
Thank you, James. Jackie, you want to finish?
So going back to that why, I can say an example that we were given that there would already be little short videos made with the community board councillors in Raumati village walking up and down the street with shots of children crossing the roads after school, and it would be saying we have to do consultation on work to improve this and this is why. And that video would be running for 2, 3, 4 weeks, even well before any public engagement begins. So just saying. And just my second point in debate, look, thank you for the report, Wayne. It's a good solid way forward. I just wanted to comment on a comment made by Councillor Coates on the Tuesday briefings. I don't think that it's quite possible to give credit to Tuesday briefings to the Martin Jenkins report, given that it was something that was asked for the entire last triennium, lobbied for on the election hustings, and then brought in as our new governance set up at the beginning of the triennium. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, did anybody hear me before?
Good. We all heard you really well, and the chief executive responded to you saying that.
Sorry, it keeps I couldn't hear any of the response. It seemed to have cut out. So
okay, I'll ask chief executive to respond exactly what he said, because I cannot recall word for word, and he's got a different accent.
Dude. Thanks, Mr. Westbury. Essentially, I said it was more a request from you, and yes, I acknowledge it, and we will ensure that we come around community boards as part of the sort of implementation process and the feedback process. If we go back to my earlier comments, which I didn't say in my first reply, this isn't the beginning this isn't the end of it. This is the beginning of it, and I would expect to see, for example, more work on individual components and more items pop up over time, such as suggestions from community boards and the process that we will work through there. So yes, we will take that on board and come back to boards to get their views and get their involvement.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're very good. Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Mayor Guru. I'd like to say well done on writing a good report here. I do want to just make it known that I do think we've missed an opportunity. We have an operating model whereby Council gives us information, and from time to time debates in a very formal setting are probably not the most conducive to finding new ways of doing things, and I had thought that we've missed an opportunity to have a workshop with councillors and the council staff and an equal footing to work through some of the possibilities that the report's outlined.
Anybody else? No? You're going right over right.
So look, I had already communicated to Wayne that I felt that it was a pretty good report, in the sense that I was quite pleased to see the approach and the way that the recommendations had been considered, the actions. I've obviously referred to the regulatory area as an example where it could have been ignored, and I absolutely understand and agree your response, Wayne, around looking at the the other aspects of it rather than just satisfaction, if I could use that term. But just taking on board Councillor McCann's comments, look, I hope that that opportunity that he has said has been missed is still an opportunity. Wayne, you used the reference that it is the beginning of the journey, not the end. And as you come back with the proposed operating models and ideas you have in terms of moving this forward, I'm sure there will be opportunities to workshop that with elected members around how does this sit, rather than, as Councillor McCann has said, in this formal setting where it simply has the mechanisms of questions and then debate. So I think we're on the right path, and I'm pleased at the way at which the Chief Executive and SLT and the team have sort of grabbed this and run with it. I actually had one question that I'd missed, and maybe I'll just leave it as a comment as my...
The question time's over, but...
Winding up. It's an important one. Was, Wayne, just around the staff. The staff have participated in the review, and I imagine many, if not most of them, have probably read or heard about the findings. And then we've got the actual actions that come out of it, and how they feed back into their group managers around their feedback on those actions. They might not agree with that approach or whatever. So I'll just leave that with you in the interest of time. But yeah, just it's good to see this progressing forward.
Okay. Recommendation 28, 29, 30, moved by Councillor James Coates, seconded by General Holbrook. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Carried. One vote against, that's Councillor Randall. We are now on item 9.4, Three Waters Reform Programme, Memorandum of Understanding and Funding Package on page 59.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, everyone. So, the paper in front of you today seeks approval to, I guess, take further or be more directly involved in the government's Three Waters review process. And Martin Cole, who's our Water and Wastewater Asset Manager, is here to just do a little bit of a brief overview of maybe a little bit of how we've got to here today, and some of the issues, I guess, and opportunities maybe as we move forward with both this paper and what the government are currently proposing.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, Mr. Mayor, councillors. I present the Three Waters Reform Package Programme, MOU and funding package paper, which potentially has significant changes for our council in terms of local government service delivery of Three Waters going into the future, and this is the first step in that process. But just to give you a bit of background, it's just over 4 years and a week or so since Havelock North contamination event occurred with Campylobacter in 2016. That made about 5,000 people ill and was contributed to a number of deaths in Havelock North as well. Just giving you a bit of background, that sparked an inquiry, a very in-depth inquiry about the regulatory system and the response and delivery of the water services in Havelock North, and came out with a large number of recommendations. From that, central government initiated a Three Waters review that's been running for a number of years, and that largely has two main streams, excuse the pun. The first one is a regulatory reform, looking at our regulatory system that looks after and makes sure we have safe, clean drinking water for our communities, have good environmental outcomes from our wastewater management and treatment, and looks after our stormwater. So that's the regulatory settings. And the other the other stream was looking at how those services of water, wastewater and stormwater, the three waters, are delivered across New Zealand, across a number of models. In the first regulatory area and regulatory regime, we've seen Te Mātou Arawai established, which is our new water Crown entity water regulator. That bill came into effect in the Crown entity midway through this year, and there's a water services bill, which is the legislative toolbox, if you like, that will allow the regulator to act, and that's expected to come into force or come into be enacted in July next year. So that's on the regulatory regime, and that consolidates a lot of pieces of legislation, the Health Act and other RMA Acts, to look at safe drinking water, wastewater management and stormwater management. Today this paper's more about the service delivery. So in working through the Three Waters Review, a number of options and models were worked through and put forward by central government in terms of how the service deliveries happen in New Zealand, largely through TAs like ourselves delivering the services directly. You've got CCO such as Watercare in Auckland, and a collaborative model such as Watercare just to the south of us. So looking across that, there's quite a clear direction from central government that they wish to see, based on their review, multi-regional water entities that would, in the first instance, deliver water and wastewater services. They should be asset owning, they'll be statutory entities in their own right, and that's to provide equitable access to services across New Zealand, improve at a national level oversight, strengthen compliance, monitoring, and also just improve outcomes is the view there, that the collective economies of scale that a multi-regional entity would achieve. So there's a clear direction from central government. That is what they are considering. The reform program that they've put out, and it's in Appendix D here, is essentially in three tranches, if you like, 3 stages, and this is the first of those 3 stages. The first stage, broadly, is about designing and exploring what those multi-regional groupings that may take on or intended to take on water services would look like, how big they would be, and who would be in. That's the first stage, is figuring out what those entities look like and the scale of them. The second stage is setting up and establishing the legislation, and for those that opt in at that stage to move towards those groupings, working towards a transition. And the third stage then is commencement of those entities. And there's a timeline in Appendix 3 of the paper that gives you an overview of that and a bit more detail about the key features of those entities. So really 3 stages, and today is about the first stage, is about Tranche 1. Tranche 1 is very much opt-in, non-binding. Tranche 1 comes with a stimulus package, as do, or is intended to, the Stage 2, the Tranche 2 and 3. So the first stage, the initial stage of the reform program and stimulus package has broadly 3 requirements. It has a Memorandum of Understanding that would need to be signed and returned by Monday, that looks to give a commitment to willingness to work with central government on the reform objectives and the core design features of a multi-regional water service entity. Look at the principles together with central government, and also share information about our 3 waters, and that also would inform those multi-regional groupings. Central government has formed a 3 waters steering committee made up of local government New Zealand representatives and Solgum and Te Mātou Arawai, our regulator, and that is there to provide support and guidance and transparency through the process for local government. So that's the 3 Waters Steering Committee. So you have an MOU, you also have a funding agreement and a delivery plan. So the MOU says we'll work together and look at those reform objectives and design the core features of what a multi-regional entity might look like. The funding, there's a stimulus package with that, and the stimulus package is broken into 2 parts. The first part is direct allocation to Kapiti Coast District Council, should it sign the MOU and work through over the next 8 to 10 months on those, looking at those groupings. That funding is about $3.1 million. There's a further regional allocation for the Wellington region, and the Three Waters Steering Group recommends that should be allocated as per the direct funding. So the understanding there would be that our allocation of that regional funding would be, again, $3.1 million. That would need to be agreed by the mayors in the district, that's the allocation that they would wish to achieve from that regional funding, and we'd need 2/3 of the entities in the region to sign up for that regional funding to be allocated. So with that funding potentially sitting on the table of $6.2 million of grant funding that doesn't need to be paid back, but you've got to opt in, sign the MOU, sign the funding agreement, and the funding agreement sets out what you can use it for on Three Waters, how would you use it, the conditions and public accountability and milestones, and a delivery plan that sets out what we would spend it on, the timelines, and what that would generate in terms of outcomes towards the objectives of the reform or the objectives of the funding, the stimulus funding. What we've proposed here is a works package that is broken into two parts. Firstly, an operational focus of about $1 million of that 6.2, which is targeted towards updating our stormwater modelling to include significant impacts of climate change, so that we're well prepared going forward in terms of determining future upgrades. We've already got a significant program of works, about $250 million of stormwater works over the next 45 years. So this modelling would further inform it with further sophistication around climate change. Also looking at water safety improvements. With new regulation comes new requirements. So with the expectation already from what we've seen from the inquiry from Havelock North, additional requirements around regulation and reporting and performance are expected. Also asset management, and also supporting the council in understanding what the groupings mean. We'd have to do work at our end to digest what those groupings and what the proposals are. So there's allocation in there for that. The balance of the stimulus funding of $5.2 million is proposed to be targeted towards the capital renewal of our Waikanae water treatment plant under the drinking water safety and resilience project. So that project was submitted for shovel-ready projects earlier on through the COVID period, and was approved for funding. But this funding is now, we've been told, takes over from the shovel-ready funding for any Three Waters allocations. So it makes sense with that approval in place to target it towards our Waikanae improvements. In that water safety and resilience program, we've also got Waikanae, Poultry and Otaki water treatment plant upgrades. Just to give you a bit of an idea, the total funding package that's sitting out there, it's $761 million is the total stimulus funding that is being allocated by government. Of that, $51 million is going to set up Te Mata Arowai, our new water regulator, and the rest has been distributed across the country based on population and landmass formulas. So Kapiti Coast District Council has made and continues to make significant investment in our water infrastructure. Certainly over the last 20 years, there's been significant advances in our water supplies from 2003 Sustainable Strategy right through to the recent water metering and river recharge projects that are now 5 years old. And we continue to make a further investment of $15 million on our treatment plants and our water safety and resilience project. In wastewater, again, significant investment with the Paraparaumu plant was commissioned in 2000, and we're just reconsenting that currently at the moment. And there's ongoing investment in ensuring that the pipes, pumps and all the other infrastructure works to make sure that the system works well. Stormwater, again, a program of $250 million worth of works program over the next 45 years, with around $4.5 million a year coming up over the next 5 years. So there has been and there continues to be significant investment in our assets, in our performance, and ongoing improvement to the service that we deliver to our communities. There are some challenges. With trying to spend this money. Havelock North was 2016, and the first long-term plan after that was 2018, and a lot of money went into local government funding at that point to address what is estimated to be about a $500 million shortfall in water treatment plant investment across the country. So already in 2018 long-term plan there was significant focus on delivery of water supply wastewater works, particularly on water supply. That will have put tension on the contracting and the delivery, consultancy and delivery arm nationally. We actually developed a strategy for this, knowing that this was coming up, that was looking to bundle together works to make our projects look more appetising to the contracting community. On top of that, now we've got another 700 million being invested or being injected into the economy over a 1-year period. That is again going to stretch our contractors and consultants to try and deliver our funding of 6.2. That said, we have a professional services panel in place, and we work very closely and have already been talking to our local contractors about opportunities to fast-track procurement, and should we accept this and take the funding, get these works delivered on the ground. I guess the other challenge there is the timeframes. The timeframes for this funding is working through a process, submitting the MOU by Monday, submitting the funding and delivery plan by the 30th of September. That would be considered by the Crown Infrastructure Partnership, who can consider the shovel-ready projects, with the release of funding March next year, and with a time frame to have that funding spent by March the following year. So those timeframes are quite progressive, and again we'd be looking at rapid ways to procure significant works to go forward. So that's another challenge that we're working through currently at the moment. So coming back to this MOU, the funding agreement and delivery plan, we've had a look at this against our significance policy, and it does not trigger a significant decision or the requirement for consultation. And there was some advice taken by the Three Water Steering Committee that's provided in the paper here today that looks at the different triggers for community consultation. That said, it's an opt-in MOU. It's non-legally binding to any further stages of consideration of what we might do or not do with our assets and services. But it's likely to be of significant interest to the public as the front end of a reform project. So clearly understanding that is of interest to the public, and providing clear and concise communication on that process and where we are in it is going to be important should we sign the MOU and participate. So further updates, and certainly to this council as well, and community boards is going to be important. Water is significant to iwi. The management and governance of water, and we will need to bring our iwi partners on that journey. This is the front end of that reform conversation. By signing the MOU, non-binding, and not making decisions about our assets or our services, it's the front end of considering what might happen in the future for service delivery for Three Waters. And having iwi in that conversation, our partners with us, will be important to take on board their views as they work forward. That is I guess a bit of background, the scale of what we're looking at. Signing a MOU to work with central government to access the stimulus funding of $6.2 million grant funding, that, and then from that point we would need to consider options forward. So it doesn't bind us or tie us to any future decisions, but it does allow us to access the funding and deliver improvements for our communities, and a grant funding that doesn't impact the rest of our program. and there's I guess a number of considerations as we work through that process and understand more about that central government proposal. That's an overview of the paper and a bit of context around it. And I'll be open to questions. The recommendations are in the back, and the recommendations allow us to move forward, should you consider that, with signing the MOU and entering into the Chief Executive entering into a funding agreement to access the funding, delivering a work program to the approved delivery plan, authorising the Mayor on behalf of the Council to sign up the allocations on the regional and potentially access another 3.1 million there. The Chief Executive to approve the expenditure under the plan. And also noting that the MOU and funding agreement can't be modified or amended, otherwise it would void those documents. So those are the documents that we have to work with in terms of the MOU and the funding agreement.
Right.
I've just got just one thing just to add in terms of the so the delivery of those projects, the Waikanae water treatment plant. So we will need to bring back a paper. Martin mentioned we're looking at procurement mechanisms that will enable us to get that work moving a lot quicker, and so that will need to come back to the council for approval. But it was one of the CIP applications that we put through to the government, and part of that was to cover the, I guess, COVID-related additional costs. So there is currently a shortfall in that project in terms of delivery. So this funding will help make up that difference in terms of funding for the project itself. But that will come back to you as a separate paper in terms of the approval to get on with the contractor.
Right. It would have been good if this paper was titled "Welcome to the Parlour, said the spider to the fly." I've got two questions. My first one is that $650,000 in terms of getting ourselves ready for the rigorous application of the national regulators compliance regime. Is it?
Part of that 650,000 is going to be directed towards those drinking water safety improvements in process and systems. In the end of 2019, the Ministry of Health, off the back of the Havelock North inquiry, issued a revised water safety planning approach, if you like, which brings another level again of requirements to local government, and we're working through that with a gap analysis and putting together a roadmap for those improvements, and we would see part of this funding directed towards that.
So, projecting into the future, do you think that the water regulators compliance regime will be so strong that there will be increasing costs for us to meet those standards?
Yes, so that $650,000, not all of that is related to the regulations. There's a significant component of that relates to the asset condition and the work that we need to do to provide further information into the review. So yes, the regulations, if you recall, we did actually, we put up an additional budget this year as part of the annual plan process for a sum of, I think, $200,000 to cover off what we believed were the additional costs associated with getting us into a better position for the regulations, and at that time also indicated there's likely to be an increased additional ongoing costs. At the moment, the bill, the Water Services Bill, I think, which replaces or repeals the Health Act, is just in its first reading. So we will need some time to have a look at that and bring back the implications for that to council, because that will potentially come into effect as of 1 July next year, which would be in advance of any new formation of sort of water authority that might be set up. So yes, if you have a look through what's proposed in that bill, there is a lot of additional reporting required in there, and we're currently looking at that to see what it might mean in terms of actual cost. And also, I know Local Government New Zealand and Water New Zealand are also pulling together submissions at the moment to reflect on some of the implications associated with that.
So there's a certain amount of unknown cost looking ahead.
Yes, there's certainly a lot more liability and requirements around compliance, but there is also further reporting, monitoring and assessments of those services within this district or within all of the TA's districts that would be required as part of that legislation, and what that might mean in terms of cost. We're not really clear at the moment what that is, but yes.
Okay. Now my second question is, if you bear with me, I'll try and develop my argument, if you like. Page 63, paragraph 40, under the heading under analysis, you state quite clearly and rightly that the government's declared intention with the reform is amalgamation into public multi-regional model. That's a given. But you also state that the council, that we think that mandatory aggregation is not necessary. So the government, we know the government position is one thing, and we are saying that's not necessary to do it mandatory, which means we may have to do it voluntarily.
Well, I think the government at the moment are not saying that that would be mandatory. They have said they would like to work alongside local government, and that I think is reflected in the working group that they've established with both Soldium and Local Government New Zealand forming part of that. But the main parties to that working group are local council mayors and chief executives. So they are hoping that they can come together with a proposal that that councils would voluntarily look to.
So
to
we've
join.
got mandatory or step by step. I wouldn't say a trap. Step by step, it becomes the way it's going to happen. So having said that, look, and then in your analysis you follow it with a list of work we have done that gives the outcomes that the government reform is seeking. Your list shows that we are already doing or have done what the outcomes they are seeking. But we have on stage one, the tranche, there's no obligation for us to go to the next stage. In paragraph 48, the third point says, it allows the council to participate in the process of designing solutions. What does that mean? And bear with me. The next one is page 61, paragraph 19, bullet point 3. Signing the MOU commits councils to work with neighbouring councils to consider the creation of multi-regional entities. So by signing the MOU, we have to start considering or start talking to our neighbours, right? So my question is, in the paper there's no strategic direction or discussion on with who we will be having this discussion with, how and when, and I don't see any money set aside for that discussion. Because this is what the government, you say that the government is going to do this, the intention is to amalgamate, and by signing it we are committed to talking to our neighbours, but the paper doesn't show the next step, or is that something yet to come?
So yes, that would be something that would that we would be working on or start working once we have access to the additional funding that is provided through this tranche one. So so the Memorandum of Understanding doesn't legally bind you to that outcome, but it requires you to actively participate in that process, and multi-regional authorities are one of those outcomes that the government have said that they see as being a solution to what they see as the problem, but that's only one of those options. By undertaking being party to the review, which will be going on regardless of whether we sign up to the MOU or receive the funding, gives us the ability to participate in that more actively, I guess, and also maybe to demonstrate that Kapiti actually is a reflection of a model that works to deliver those outcomes exactly as it says in the paper, without being part of a multi-regional entity. So
you're hopeful that that's a possibility, looking ahead, that we could need
Kapiti could lead the
revolution.
country. And certainly, we will be using this money to highlight the benefits of the work that we've done, but also, there are areas that we have areas that we do need to invest in. So Martin's talked about the water safety and resilience work, the wastewater treatment plant. So there are things that
Sean,
we need to do.
it's one thing to talk in terms of showing that we are doing all the things which the outcomes what the government is seeking through the reforms, and it's another thing to start talking with our neighbours. So are we going to start talking to our neighbours, and if so, when will this discussion come to us?
So if you just, in Appendix 3 there, it gives a bit more information about the Three Waters Reform Programme and splits it into the government in terms of their actions and the sector itself. So the government would be providing guidance to the sector on the entity design considerations and confirming the features through this Tranche 1 funding. So whilst, in terms of a multi-regional, we're not just talking the Wellington region, we're probably talking 3 to 5 entities across the country is what's being discussed, and that's potentially Lower North Island, Upper North Island splits. So it's neighbours and beyond, which whilst there's further information and further clarity required from government about how that process and how they would see that roll out, it certainly indicates that there would be a central government would be providing that guidance and framework potentially for us to feed into and be part of that conversation.
So I would just add to that the comment, the paragraph 39 on the table, the funding that's provided is what we would be utilising to develop that plan and bring it back to council in terms of structure as to what we intend to do. The timeframes associated with all of this work have been extremely tight, so just to get the paper in front of council, and we had to organise a couple of briefings just to talk through the issues. That would be part of the next stage of work, to come back and talk through an outline, I guess, as to how we might see that developing in terms of works.
The chief executive and then Councillor McCann. Oh, he's gone. Did somebody press his button and he bank off?
It's been on all last week. I just want to step back a bit and go that back at the beginning of this calendar year, LGNZ, there's a thing called a Central Local Government Forum that happens about once a year between sort of the Prime Minister and some senior cabinet ministers and LGNZ. And they talked about this water issue, and LGNZ's bottom line was, we would like to work together, but our bottom line is you must not say it's compulsory aggregation. And so the government agreed on that basis that it would be voluntary. So that was the point at which everyone agreed to get around the table and work together on it. I hear your querying tone about how it might go going forward, and I acknowledge that is part of it, that where they say at the moment it's going to be entirely voluntary, but we really encourage you to think about these types of models. They have also said quite explicitly, if you think that shared services with your direct neighbour would be good enough, we're saying it's not. So they're giving some pretty clear steers, as Sean and Martin have been saying. But at this stage, they're still saying, get round the table so that you can be part of the conversation, because if you're not at the table, you miss that opportunity, arguably. Talk as a region and with your other neighbours, and let's see where this takes us. So they haven't yet determined how the program to deliver this sector-wide engagement will play out. They are still, as they are with many things, running it out as fast as they can, and we're having to keep up. So I would just say that on that basis that if it does remain voluntary all the way through this process, we should be a part of influencing what designs could look like, because we can tell a good story.
Just that my fear is, we are swimming with sharks, and we could easily be swallowed up. So. James, Councillor Randall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Martin, well done. You're one of the unsung heroes of Kapiti, because people don't see the work you've been doing. My question is, are you planning any open days this coming summer season for the public? You had some successful ones some time ago.
We did used to run those. The COVID, I mean, with the current environment, we're not potentially looking at any in the short term, but happy to talk to you about that offline as to what we might look to in the future.
Yeah, we're always happy to explain what happens in the background, and the real unsung heroes are the people on the tools that make it all happen. And just at the moment in level 2, we're keeping our bubble around them pretty tight.
We do have quite a there's a YouTube. There's a video that we've put together. That looks at the operation of the water treatment plant with Bruce and the team on that.
We can certainly share that. The more people that and open days are a great idea because people get to see what's happening up at the treatment plants, and generally people walk away with a sense of comfort and confidence that it's happening well. But we can certainly provide information, and we've got a recent video we've done on that and open day presentations.
And Bernie, rest assured, you are also one of our unsung heroes.
Me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Councillor Coates.
Morning, Martin. So a number of questions. Directly relating to the paper, I've got page 63, number 37. You gave a bit of an explanation for this, and then I think His Worship the Mayor sort of undid that for me a little bit. I just want clarification around the regional allocation. My understanding of it was that here's your amount and here's a regional allocation that you can kind of bid for. I then understand there's been a bit of a discussion around we're having none of that. I think the Mayor's words were keep your mitts off our money. What I'm hearing from you today is that, and in the paper, that there's been at the time of writing an agreement reached, but then as I think Your Worship the Mayor said, we're still in discussions. So can we have some clarification just around, because that can quickly change if we're not
I'll answer that because Martin hasn't been privy to the meetings. The Mayor did say that. There was a suggestion that the 50% regional share should be allocated towards regional priorities. That doesn't work for obviously 3 councils who don't belong to Wellington Water. And so we were all prepared to have quite a detailed conversation about that, but we are pleased to say that our colleagues acknowledged that, and as a result I have a draft letter which does confirm that the balance will be allocated according to the exact same formula, so we will get
That's the confirmation I needed, thank you. The next one is around public perception and the big question around privatisation. In the Three Waters workshop, it was pretty clear that was off the table. Then I received the meeting notes from the Three Waters workshop, and privatisation is mentioned once in the document, my quick search, and that's relating to the question, and it isn't actually answered. I guess my concern is we look back, we've heard the airport discussion this morning where decisions were made years ago and previous councils now criticised for those decisions based on promises made then. And I don't want to be, and that I want to at least know that I've asked that question around what's the signal around privatisation, because we're aware of it going through the workshops, but those either watching or reading about this in days or weeks to come, that is their first thought when I've seen stuff, at least on social media, is around privatisation.
Yes, and I guess that's what's picked up in this consideration of significance around public interest, about where does this go, and Nanaia Mahuta, the local government minister, has been reinforcing that message that any future asset-owning entity, the assets will remain in public ownership. The structure of that would be yet to be decided, so very clear that that remains publicly owned, indicating potentially with a preference for collective council ownership of some form of model that would be maybe developed over the next 6 to 8 months in conversation.
Exactly right. But the only thing I want to add is the structure does not yet exist. So what they have said very clearly is they don't see a CCO as being the right answer. Some elements of CCO models they see as being part of the answer. So they've been very clear to say this will be a new statutory entity. The structure of it has not yet been designed.
Councillor McCann, before you left, did you have your hand light up?
JB's got shot back. Sorry, I have a few more questions, Your Worship. We'll get there. Thank you. So page 65, under tangata whenua considerations, I'm more referring now to the report that came out from the workshops. I'm just going to flick to that. And so under common questions, comments and considerations, I'm not going to read it all out, but to summarise, it talks about feedback from council and iwi Māori participants around the importance. And then there's a comment from the steering group committee that says it agrees that participation is crucial. The answer that I got given on the day when I asked the question and the actual feedback in their document, which I'm assuming you've seen, it still doesn't reassure me that they take on the importance, or they're not demonstrating how they are going to consider local iwi, hapu, mana whenua considerations. And the example I used, in some districts it might be simple where there's one, and ours there's three, and then in others there's possibly more. And I've just given a very bland, we acknowledge that's important, and I think if I use the Chief Executive's words, we haven't yet worked that out, we don't know. But well, my concern is by moving the recommendations today, they're very benign and bland in terms of achieving the outcome of accepting the funding and the thing, but it doesn't actually acknowledge our concerns around things like the privatisation, things like iwi participation, and the concerns we have for our local iwi to be fully engaged in this. So that was a long thing, but the question is essentially around the reassurance, not necessarily from yourself, but how do we signal that in terms of, do we just accept this today in terms of the recommendations, or do we clarify that through comms, through a media release?
So as Martin pointed out, you don't get any chance to add conditions. You either accept it as it is or you don't. The steering committee in particular on our behalf, but all of the sector have been saying very strongly, you are underestimating the importance of this to iwi and you are not involving them appropriately in our opinion. And that means at the table alongside us. They have talked about separate engagement with all iwi across the country, and they've done a little bit of that, I believe. So the best I think I can give you is an assurance that the steering committee, who do represent councils across the country, who represent us, are pushing that, and that we need to keep pushing that. And it's not only iwi either, it's to make sure that we're all appropriately involved through the participation. I'm a bit concerned that they think the kind of workshop that they ran in Wellington is sufficient, and a couple more of those ought to do it. That won't cut the mustard. So we can't set conditions. I can only assure you that everyone is having continuous conversations about those issues, and we need to keep pushing as a sector to make sure they're appropriately resolved. Do you want anything? You're right.
James.
Thanks for that, Wayne. The next one was around, and it's already covered in the report, it's more in terms of the meeting notes from the workshops. So my memory serves me correctly, I think we've spent about $90 million in this sort of space over the last 10 years, possibly more. And just a little side note, when we're talking about our finances, that's a considerable chunk of our net debt to get into the position that we're in nationally. It was raised in the under the questions and comments around participants asked if they could use the funding on non-Three Waters spend if their council was confident. I think our question was more around, could we use it in the stormwater space? And the response through the formal response back through is this funding can be used for capital or operating expenditure in line with the reform objectives. It cannot be swapped out for existing council spending. The project that we've got there, wasn't that, I mean, I'm all for doing it, but wasn't that existing council spending?
So yes, I think that figure's about 90 million over the last 10 years on the three waters. But so the stormwater work that we're proposing was actually through the LTP sort of moderation process. We had staged that over 2 years, just from an affordability point of view. What we're saying is that we'd like to bring that work forward and deliver it in the 12 months over the next year. So it isn't in the current annual plan. That was one of the issues that was raised. Certainly at that workshop, even though stormwater isn't their current priority, they've certainly made it clear that that was an available option if you chose to go down that path. And we believe also that the amount of investment that the council have actually put into the water sector, or the water infrastructure that we have, that it's a legitimate request to be looking to advance that stormwater work, which is an area where we have an issue in terms of upgrades and flooding related problems.
And that's more my concern around the ability for us to spend it in that area.
Yeah, so that's my expectation, that that's how they will treat it. Like I said, they've said that openly at that meeting, that they will consider stormwater. We've made it very clear, and the paper makes it clear how much we've invested and what work we've done in the water area. The stormwater modelling was staged over 2 years, so it isn't in the current annual plan. So again, that meets their criteria, and we have a contract in place for that work. So delivery again isn't as significant an issue as maybe some of the capital funding. So again, we believe that that's enough of a position to secure the funding.
Councillor Elliott and Councillor Holbrook.
Thank you. I have a question around process today. In my early years of council and before being in council, I fought like a cat for the public's protection of our ownership of our water system. And while council did hardly anything to please me at the time, one of the good outcomes was the very robustness of section 9.16 of our standing orders, which covers the 75 requirement for a 75% majority of council members present and voting on decisions relating to any divestment of ownership of water assets under section 130, 131 and 137 of the Local Government Act, or in any other situation. So I'm really wanting this noted in the minute, if I could, somehow, that I've brought this up today. Because I know it will be argued that we're not actually changing ownership of the water today. All we're doing is signing an MOU. However, under section 137 of the Local Government Act, this is triggering the point 1, point 2 and point 3. In the middle of that, point 3, it's doing so without consultation.
You've got a question there.
Yep. My first question for today is to our governance staff. Can this be noted that this has been brought up today in the minute? And has our requirement under section 9.16 of the standing orders been taken into consideration today? And will there be a requirement for a 50-50 vote today to pass these recommendations, or will it be a 75%, 25% vote? That's my question. That's my question.
I think the report already considers those particular elements you've got. Do you want to explain that one?
I was just going to reconfirm that we have considered those. We've had legal advice provided directly related to council's own current standing orders, and the sector has also had legal advice provided by Citizen Greers in regards to significance, and that doesn't trigger the requirement to either enact that clause within the standing orders or the local government related clauses that relate to significance.
So I understood it that the legal determination there, legal opinion, was sought on behalf of not the council but the group in Wellington, and that related to specifically to significance policy, not necessarily to our standing orders and our own special requirement in here. I couldn't see any reference in the papers or supporting papers to our requirement here.
Well, I can confirm that it does reflect a legal opinion as to our own standing orders, but also the sector-wide review. So there's two pieces of advice, and I don't know whether the paragraph 61 to 63 don't specifically reference that, but that certainly is the case. Yeah, I mean, it's an agreement to actually enter into that discussion. There's no agreement to actually lock in any sort of transfer of assets or management or any of those things. So that's primarily the reason behind it.
And
however, 157.3 of Local Government Act does say, however, before a local government organisation enters into a joint arrangement or joint local government arrangement, exactly what we're doing. It must, A, in the case of a local government organisation that is a local authority, have undertaken consultation in accordance with the procedures set out in part of it, or B, in the case of a local government organisation that is not a local body authority, have undertaken consultation on accordance with the procedures set out in part of it, as if it were a local authority. So I'm just signalling that this is something that will be coming up, and you may have to spend $85,000 whatever it is at some point to have a referendum in the district moving forward with this. That's the first thing I wanted to note today. And I have a question.
I mean, paragraph 64 of the document reflects, I guess, what we've stated previously, that we don't consider that the MOU triggers any explicit requirement for consultation under the Local Government Act, and it's a memorandum of understanding that would provide funding, and then we would be partaking in a discussion with local government or central government, as to what that might look like. So there is no binding requirement to do anything that relates to transferal or shifting responsibility for maintenance operations or any of those activities.
If I can add, I'm just looking for the section on the Act, but we are not entering into any formal joint arrangement. So to agree to have a meeting about stuff and to participate in meetings is not a formal joint arrangement, such as a joint committee, which does trigger those requirements. And the key words are non-binding.
Okay, I guess I'm talking more to the spirit of the intention of the standing order when Mayor Rowan and her council, thank goodness, sat down and wrote this. I would suspect that signing an MOU to them would have been a bit of a trigger. That's my opinion. I guess my second question was one that I had at the last briefing, and I answered, and so far I haven't received any answer. Doesn't probably refers not so much to parts of your report, but I had a general question about the value and ownership of our public assets, especially our water assets, or certainly including them, is already divested as part of security for the local government funding agency bonds. Ownership of those is already parked over there. And we were going to see if
Sorry,
how the
Councillor,
government
that's
would
not
handle
correct.
that.
Sorry, Councillor, that's not correct.
Oh, sorry. I thought the last briefing you agreed that was correct, and that you would find out what the government wanted to do about that.
No, that's not correct. We can go away and get that information, but the borrowing that we do through LGFA basically is secured over rates, which is not our assets. So they can't secure our assets. What they can do is require that we would rate fund any repayments. So
yeah. However, it is when the bonds are sold overseas to overseas or other investors that they are given that ownership already as security. It's in the bond.
No, that's not correct.
Well, I'm sorry, but I've seen it in overseas. I've seen it when it's been presented to investors overseas.
Councillor Elliott, I would suggest that.
Anyway, we'll leave that one.
No. If you've got issues offline, you can continue that with the Chief Executive.
No, they were pretty much for this conversation. And just thirdly, we have the recommendations. However, at the end of them, it notes that this MOU that we're signing is going to be effective until the 30th of June 2021. I was just going to ask if we could perhaps note, as part of the after the recommendations, that the CE will be staff will be a report back to Council prior to the 30th of June 2021, so that we can assess what the next steps will be.
There'll be a report coming anyway. More than one. Council Compton, thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Just following on from that, so obviously for that phase 2, if we were to say the government does say yes, let's have regional entities, that would trigger us to have a referendum unless we altered our standing orders. Is that correct?
I guess potentially, but it would depend on the mechanism by which central government sets up that structure and how they would look to move councils into that new structure. So until we know what that looks like,
so they might take that decision out, that aspect of the decision out of our hands.
They could do as part of that process.
I actually pushed the button to look to move the recommendations
I
because it
think,
appeared the questions were tailing off. But I see Councillor Holborough has come in just
yeah.
List 3 times.
She has signalled that she wants to move. Yeah.
I actually had a couple of questions. Thank you for this report. I think it outlines our position really well. It's tempting to note quite a lot of it in the recommendations, but I think it's enough that there are some strong words in the report about how we feel about particularly mandatory aggregation and where we're sitting in terms of our water space. Having preempted my question with that, under tangata whenua, it does note that we will need to talk to tangata whenua. I wonder what conversations have we had so far and what level of understanding of this is there within Te Whakaminenga and Te Aotearoa ki Whakarongotai?
Well, we haven't had any direct conversations to date, although our iwi representative team did attend the workshop that was held in Wellington. So, yeah, and some of our other iwi partners were at that same workshop. So that workshop set out the background, set out the proposal, and set out the timeframes that they were working with. So, I would assume they're aware of it to that extent, but part of the process moving forward would be more direct engagement.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll look forward to hearing how that plays out. Paragraph, I can't find it right now, but it talks about how we are opposed to mandatory aggregation. Is it still local government as a whole position that they're opposed to mandatory aggregation?
Yeah, yes, I'm pretty sure that's their current position.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I can confirm that's the National Council's LGNZ's position. Formally has not changed. It's been in place for some years now. That they oppose mandatory aggregation.
I think that's important to note that. There was one last one that I had, which was... Yeah, no, I'll leave it. Happy to move the recommendations if there's nobody else on the list except for James.
James Goods. Right. Open for debate. Anybody? Oh, you write introduction?
Yes, I think Guru put it quite well when he said, welcome to the parlour, said the spider to the fly. I'd like to reiterate that. This is a big day, and though I don't agree with Councillor Elliott that this triggers our 75% majority, I think what she was speaking to was the magnitude of what's happening today in terms of this potentially being the first step in a very significant process which will affect potentially the whole of local government and the structures and purposes of local government, not just in the water space. So I don't think the importance of this can be understated. And though it's not in the recommendations, I think the report reflects that we're well aware of that and that we'll be pushing back hard to make sure that the investment that our community has made over generations in the water space doesn't disappear into a big mass of problems with water and underinvestment across the country. So we're well aware of that, and I guess we'll just have to keep going through this. And I want to acknowledge the work that Sean and Glenn have done in this space and the level of understanding and the level of engagement they have in this whole process. It's really valuable to have that within our organisation, and I don't think that the value of that can be overstated. So thank you very much for this report today. It's a thorough and powerful report and includes quite a lot of information in the appendices too. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll move the recommendation.
Right. Anybody else? Councillor Coates.
Yeah, look, it's having been around the table for a while, it's an interesting day. I think that gets very similar to Super City discussion, although with a different outcome, which is one that's likely to happen, whereas the Super City one didn't. And why I say that is, as much as I'm uncomfortable about aspects of it, there is an opportunity here. There's a funding opportunity, but there's also a responsibility for us to represent the community both today and in the months and years moving forward. I think that's where our role in speaking to Councillor Elliott's concerns will play heavily around representing those community views throughout the process, and as the Chief Executive and the staff have said, through being involved, being in the tent and actually helping shape some of that decisions at the end of the day. I am concerned around, and look, you're going to get sick of this word, but the rationale or the why, where we get it, but some of the questioning that I was asking was leading to actually what the community perception is about this. And so I think that our communications around that is really important. It sort of briefly touched on, to talk to Sue in the report, but you know, looking at what are those big question marks that are going to be out there for the community. I see Councillor Compton did quite a good piece on his Facebook page in terms of explaining some of it, but the thing is, if there are voids in information in the council comms, it will end up being asked to be filled by councillors and elected members, and we're not always resourced to be able to do that on the fly Monday to Sunday. So the comms are going to be critical around why we're supporting this, what this means for the district. I know that this is another thing thrust on us by central government, and we're not fully resourced to deal and respond to everything, but it is quite an important one. I don't take lightly the points that I made around iwi, that I made around, and I think the position on privatisation was made pretty clear in the workshop, but it's just not made clear in their future communication. So again, that will come back to us as elected members, concerns from within the community, and already is. But I think we just need to make the most of both the funding, which obviously your team will, and the opportunity that exists to help shape the way this moves forward. And also to highlight the great job that the team has done over the last 10 years in positioning us in that space.
Thank you. Just carrying on from some of those themes that were picked up there, I think this is it is a significant day in terms of this represents potentially a big change for the sector, and it was something that was noted in the summary that came through from the steering group around some of the concerns about local government, about what this actually means for a whole sector, not just the water part of it, but there's a massive impact. And I was listening to RNZ's The Detail podcast yesterday, which was specifically about the three waters, and up in Northland they referred to it as a Trojan horse. But I'd say in this case, we know that Odysseus is in there with 39 other Greeks, and yes, they're not necessarily coming to sack our city of Troy, but I'd make the point that actually if you follow the story of Troy to its conclusion, the refugees end up in Italy, they help found Rome, and they actually come back and conquer the Greeks in the end. So, there's opportunities for local government in this, no matter how it goes. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to take over central government, but actually there will be, opportunities that potentially come out of this. If we lose Three Waters, potentially we pick up other stuff. And that's one point I'd really strongly encourage as these discussions take place over the next, about 10 months that this is going to take place, that we have to push government to have that discussion about the structure and the role of local government concurrently with this, because we can't go to our constituents to the middle of next year and say we're going to lose the Three Waters without something else to show what local government's going to do, because as we were discussing the other day, and this is true across the country, it's around about a third of council's assets and revenue around the country, and that's a massive change. So the whole picture has to be considered. It can't just be the water conversation. So, and that sort of speaks to the point that Councillor Elliott was talking about this is why it's in the standing orders to have those thresholds, because it is such an important issue for our communities, for iwi. They have really specific interests in the ownership of water and how it's allocated. So obviously, big chunky discussions to have in the months ahead, and I think we need to be cognizant of the risks in that to our community, as has been highlighted by being lost in a regional entity potentially, but also the opportunities that could open up for us as well. So it's always a balancing act, and it'll be really interesting to see how it goes, and I'm obviously going to be in support of today's recommendations.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, and thank you, staff, for bringing for your work thus far and bringing this paper to us. In a way, Capita's just too good for this. You've done a solid job, and I guess I wish for after the next 10 months or during the next 10 months that no matter what happens, that we are recognised for the position that we're in as a district, the robustness of our own infrastructure, and that we don't end up just paying for someone else's because of that we actually end up ensuring that we get really good solid negotiation to ensure that we kept in that position and that we are in some way rewarded for that. So I'm pretty sure there's enough votes around the table here to make sure that we get $6.2 million. I'm not going to include my vote in that, but I'm definitely going to be working forward with this project. I'm just not really, I do this with a very heavy heart, and I'm just not going to say yes today. You're going to have enough votes to do this, and thank you.
Councillor Holbrook or Rob McCann.
I'd like to just comment that I agree with everything Gwen Compton has said. And I do that without being facetious. And James, I think there's been some incredibly thoughtful debate, and it was a very well written report as well. I'd like to thank you for that. And I think that while it's not in the recommendations, I'm sure that the C will take cognizance that we want central government to be thinking about the wider implications that this has, as opposed to just trying to fix a Three Waters problem, which our council have clearly been on top of for a little while compared to some other places in the country. So I think it's really important. Everything that Gwen was saying, as the most recent person to say it, is so important because it fundamentally changes what councils may or may not be able to deliver.
Councillor Holbrook, right of reply.
Yes, and thank you, Martin. Sorry, could you Glenn before Sean. I just want to say that what Councillor Elliott touched on, we are recognised nationally, and I know that from my experience in the National Policy Advisory Group, we are recognised for our work in the water space. So, so that's definitely true that we are recognised for that. So. Yes, I think one of the main reasons I'm voting for this today, and I think it would be irresponsible for anybody to vote against it, is that we have an obligation under the Local Government Act to deliver services in a cost-effective manner, and to turn down significant funding would be irresponsible for us as elected members. And I know that a lot of councils are grappling with this around the country, but if the workshop that a number of the councillors attended, and the three staff who are here today all attended, sitting at the table all attended too, and our iwi partners attended. We had a strong representation at that meeting, as did almost all of the councils. some of the Wairarapa weren't there, but the feeling in that room, if it's reflected across the country, was that this first tranche would be accepted, but there was going to be a strong pushback in those tranches further down the track. So I don't think we're alone in grappling with this today, and I think most councils are signing up to this across the country. So let's see where this takes us. Thank you.
Right, recommendation 69 to 75, moved by Councillor Janet Halborough, seconded by James Coates. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? You want that recorded? No. Yes, no. Yes. Carried. Thank you very much, Sean and the unsung hero. I'm gonna use that all the time now. Do some promotions. Item 9.5, order of candidate names on voting papers, Waikanae Community Board by-election, page 87. Diane, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've nothing to add to this paper. I'm happy to take any questions through the Mayor.
Right, questions? Councillor Rabanov, you're waiting, eh?
Yes, thank you. I should press my button more regularly, shouldn't I?
I'm a slow learner. I'm doing that.
In relation to this by-election, when the candidates' names, when a candidate submits their name, is that going to be put onto the website, KCDC website?
Yes, information about the by-election in general and about the candidates will be on the website.
So it'll come on as they put their names forward, as they are...
Oh, I see, sorry. I can come back to you on actually how and when the names will be loaded.
Thank you.
Councillor McCann?
Has there been any research done with councillors and board members whose names start with M or lower as to whether they are more likely to agree with alphabetisation or whatever the word is, or random orders?
Absolutely, there has been.
You would think that Jackie would want it sort of not or alphabetical order, but she has not. She's always stuck for random. That's your benchmark.
Completely anecdotally, what the Councillor Elliott just said is definitely true. We would argue we have seen a pattern to people's voting over the triennia in terms of their preferences, and we would argue anecdotally that it does usually, but not always, reflect your surname and where you sit in the alphabet.
It's a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest, isn't it?
No, I don't think it's a conflict of interest, Mr. Mayor, but that would depend on you thinking that it does make a difference, and you could always argue that in making your decision you don't believe it makes a difference. So,
Councillor Halborough.
Would it be appropriate for people whose last names fall in the middle of the alphabet to move and second this motion?
Absolutely.
I think we're getting tired, Mr. Mayor.
That's right. Now, somebody move something.
I'm happy to move recommendation 1C, random order.
I second that. Recommendation 1C, moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by the Mayor. Any debate? No debate.
I just think we're just too democratic for words around this table.
Wow. Okay, all those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Carried. 1C. Right, thank you very much. The last item is the confirmation of minutes. Item 10, page 89. Somebody moves.
I'm happy to move that the minutes of the Kapiti Coast District Council on the 27th of August 2020, as published on page 90 of elected members' papers, are a true and accurate record.
Wow.
No. If you go back to page 89, you'll see the resolution is worded slightly different to what you just read out.
Okay.
And you're the one who always
the-
told James that you've got to go according to the recommendation. Remember that?
I thought mine was better. But I will move the recommendation as worded on page 89.
Can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Elliott. I put to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Carried. That brings us to the end of the meeting. Thank you very much. It's been a short meeting really, but pretty important items. Thank you. You'll get random.